To Exodus 17. Exodus 17, this was from Monday's reading last week. And we'll read just a portion of Exodus 17. The first 6 verses is all. As we consider an event that I think most of us are familiar with, or at least, well, we're probably not as familiar with this event as we will be with one we'll talk about in a moment. But we'll recognize this event even if we haven't been able to keep up in the reading. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I'll stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." Now, this seems to be a simple enough story. It seems to be relatively straightforward. The people were out in the wilderness, and they were thirsty, and they wanted Moses to do something about it. Moses asked God what he could do, and God told him to strike the rock at Horeb and that water would flow, and he did it, and it did. However, this isn't the end of the story. This is only the beginning of a story that would not be completely told for a while. Look at Numbers chapter 20. Numbers chapter 20 is... We're going to find out in a moment how far removed from the events of Exodus 17, but is removed from the events of Exodus 17, and it creates an opposite bookend for this story. It starts here, and it ends here, and it really, we're going to find out, doesn't really end there, because we actually get some more information later about these events and what's going on. But these two things, and all of the time span between them, together are telling a big narrative that we're supposed to learn some things from. And so in Numbers 20, starting in verse 1, the Bible says, "And the people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, 'Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we should die here, both us and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates. There's no water to drink.' Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Take the staff, assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them, and give drink to the congregation and their cattle.' And Moses took the staff before the Lord, as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, 'Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?' And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given you.'" Now, There's a lot of similarities between these two things. There's a lot of parallels between these two accounts. And if you aren't careful, you might read them and think that they are two accounts of the same event, but they are not. There are some important differences that we need to note. First off, there is a great difference in time between these two events. In Exodus chapter 12, we are given a time marker, and from that point, Exodus 12, till the end of the book of Exodus, everything there takes place in a year. In Exodus 12 and verse 2, it says, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." And so at that point, God resets their calendar, says it's now month 1. We're starting the calendar here. And all the way at Exodus 40 in verse 17, it says, "In the first month of the second year, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was erected." And so everything that took place from Exodus 12 to Exodus 40 happens in that year, from the first month of the first year to the first month of the second year. Numbers picks up a month later than where Exodus ends. At the beginning of the book of Numbers, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month of the second year, after they had come up out of the land of Egypt. And so when you get to the end of Exodus, that's the first day of the first month of the second year. Where Numbers picks up is the first day of the second month of the second year, and then works forward from there. Now, we got to be fair and acknowledge that not everything in Numbers is strictly chronological. So you have to read the context and see if it's reflecting about something that happened at a different time. But the general time frame of the book of Numbers begins after the book of Exodus and looks forward to things that took place. And if you do all the work and you look at it closely, what you'll find out is that the events of Numbers 20 are about 40 years later than the events of Exodus 17. So 4 decades passed, and another event took place that was extremely similar to where this story started. And I find that interesting. I find it interesting that 40 years of trusting in God, 40 years of being fed by God, 40 years of being supplied water and clothes and everything that you need in life by God, 40 years of God providing for them a direction to go and instructions on what to do and a tabernacle to build and all the things that they did in that time frame. And they still find themselves in exactly the same place faith-wise that they started. When they get a little bit thirsty, they start grumbling and complaining and say, "Why have you brought us out here in the desert to die?" It's in a different place as well. You might have noticed Exodus 17 said they were in Rephidim. That's where they had encamped. In Numbers 20, they're in Kadesh. Different location. And different circumstances. God said in Exodus 17:6 for him to take the staff and to strike the rock, and it says Moses did so. In Numbers chapter 20, God said, "Take the staff and speak to the rock." And Numbers 20 and verse 11 says, Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. That is not what God told him to do. There's a different result in what happened. In the first case, in Exodus 17, God provided water, and he does not discipline Moses and Aaron. Everything's fine. They did exactly what they were told to do. God did what he promised, and it worked out exactly the way it was supposed to. In Numbers 20, God provided the water, sure enough. But then he said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." Notice that God did not punish the people for Moses' unbelief. Moses was the one with Aaron, his brother, that is said by God to have failed to believe him. So God went ahead and provided the water for the people. He didn't punish the people for Moses and Aaron's unbelief. But he did discipline Moses and Aaron. And he told them, you're not going to live to enter into the promised land. And neither of them did. Both of them died before that day. In fact, the interesting thing about Moses is Moses was 120 years old. The Bible says he was as strong as he had been in the prime of his life. His eyes had not dimmed in the least. He was still a very virile and strong and powerful and healthy man. And God said, it's time for them to go in. And I told you, you couldn't go. And he died and God buried him. So there was some discipline that took place because they disbelieved God. And there's something else I want to notice about this before we move on. What happened here was God said, speak to the rock. And Moses took the staff and hit the rock twice. And God didn't say, because you did not obey me. God said, because you did not believe me. Understand that those ideas are essentially synonymous. When God gives a commandment, if we believe the commandment, then we do the commandment. If we don't do the commandment, then we don't believe God. And that's an important lesson for people today who want to live their own lives and practice their own religion and say, I love God and I believe God, but then they don't do what he says. And what God says very clearly here, when Moses chooses to do something different than what God said, is his problem was he didn't believe him. Because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the Lord. That's the next thing I want you to understand. The only way in the world that we can possibly uphold God as holy before other people is by obeying the commands of God. We can speak all day and say whatever we want to and lift our hands up and say all kinds of things that sound religious and look impressive. But if we aren't doing what he told us to do, we are not lifting God up before the people. We want to lift God up before the people, we'd better be doing exactly what he commanded us to do. Because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. So, why do we have these two records? What do we learn from them? I think that there may be several things to be learned, and I'm not going to talk about all of them here tonight, but there are a few things that I do want to draw our attention to in the time that we have left. Number one, I would suggest to you that God means what he says. He wanted Moses to strike the rock in Rephidim. He said, get the staff, the one that you hit the Nile with, you carry that staff with you. When you get to the rock, before the people of the congregation, you strike that rock, and I'll provide water. That is exactly what he told Moses. That is exactly what he wanted. And then when they got to Kadesh 40 years later, he said, you assemble the congregation together, you get that staff, you walk before the people, and when you get to that rock, speak to it. And that is exactly what God wanted him to do. God knew what he wanted, and he asked for what he wanted. Someone might object, but God didn't tell him not to strike the rock. You ever heard anybody say that? Well, God didn't say not to do this. God didn't say we couldn't do that. He didn't have to. He told him what he wanted him to do. When you get to the rock this time, even though I've told you to get that same staff, even though I've told you to assemble that same group of people, even though I've told you to walk before them and do this in their presence, what I want you to do this time is ask the rock to give its water. And that's exactly what he expected to be done. To not respect exactly what God has asked, Moses and Aaron disbelieved and dishonored God. Because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people. It's no different for us. God means what He says. So in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 17, for instance, we read, "Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." What that means to me is I need to be more careful than Moses was. I need to pay more attention than what Moses did. I need to be careful to understand exactly what God is asking for in this circumstance that I'm in and do just that thing exactly the way God asked for it. Not ad-libbing, not adding my own flair, not making it interesting, not being dramatic. Imagine how dramatic it was for Moses to make his speech, "You rebels," and slam the stick down on the rock. Sure, it made an impression on some folks. It made an impression on God, too. Then Moses didn't believe in Him. And that Moses hadn't honored Him. Do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. We need to be careful. We need to see what God is actually asking. We need to not make assumptions that because He asked for something at one time and in one place, that is the same thing that He is asking for at this time and in this place. We need to be careful and make sure that what we're doing is what we've been asked to do. Number 2, obedience matters. God had asked for Moses to strike a rock for water. He had. Then He later says, request the rock, speak to the rock, that it will give its water. Once upon a time, God asked for priests to go into a temple and to offer animal sacrifices. And He later tells us to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service. He wanted what He asked for then, and He wanted it to be done in that way, and He wants what He asked for today, and He wants it to be done in the way that He's prescribed it for us to do. We need to be careful to be obedient to what He's asked for. What would happen if we were today offering animal sacrifices? Besides the fact that Peter would pick at us, God would sit up in heaven and say, why do these people disbelieve me? Why won't these people honor me? What I've asked from them is not an animal sacrifice. What I've asked from them is to make themselves a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to me. That's the service that I want from them. God once allowed instruments to be used in worship. You can read about it many times throughout the Old Testament, where instruments were played. Other things were done like that in connection to their worship. But then He later says in Ephesians 5 and verse 18, be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing, making melody with your Lord in your heart. Yes, once upon a time, He had allowed and asked and given commandment through David to play in honor and to worship Him through instruments. But that is not what He asked for this time. Just as He once asked Moses to strike the rock and later says to Moses, speak to the rock, He does the same thing here. He asked for instruments then, and He says to us now, you make the melody in your heart. You engage and express in your psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs words to teach and admonish one another. You sing. That's what I want from you. Moses, not discerning the different commands, was the basis for which he was kept from entering the promised land. Now here's the question. What do you think, not discerning the commands of God that He has given us, will keep us from? I don't even feel obligated to answer that question. I think it's pretty obvious. The promise that's been given to us, the inheritance that we've been promised. Thirdly, our anger does not achieve the righteousness of God. Going back to Numbers 20 again, starting in verse 8, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. Go to the rock and say, rock, give us water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. Now it's important to note that we read this earlier, and it's there in the text, that these people were grumbling, that these people were angry, that these people were accusing Moses, that these people were not happy. And I would imagine that Moses was just as frustrated this time as he was the first time. In fact, the text bears that out because he throws himself at the entrance of the tent of meeting and says, God, what would you have me to do? How am I supposed to appease these people? I can't do anything to help them, and I can't satisfy them. He tells him what he wants him to do. Verse 10 says that Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said, Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? That's not what God said. But I want to read that because I want you to understand that's the way he's looking at these people. They're grumbling, they're rebels, they're in rebellion, open rebellion against him and against God. And he's just a little bit frustrated and a little bit angry. You ever thrown anything around or hit anything when you had lost your temper? You ever slammed a door? You ever slammed, well, you can't do this anymore. Cell phones are a pain because of that. All you can do is hit the end button really hard, and that's ineffective. Back in the old days when we had real telephones, you could slam the receiver down. That gave you some satisfaction. That's what's going on here with Moses when he strikes the rock. He doesn't hit it once, he hits it twice. He's angry. He's frustrated. He's venting. He gives them a speech that God didn't ask him to do, calling them rebels, and then hits the rock with his stick twice. The rock did, in fact, yield the water. There's something important that we learn in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4, though. Something very important about this rock that provided them water in the wilderness. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. This is the Christ who is present before them, supplying them the saving water. What we see in this event is a devoted man of God in Moses, who apparently gave in to his anger and frustration. Instead of doing what God asked him to do, he rebuked those people that had frustrated him. And he hit the rock twice, instead of simply saying, rock, yield your water. You know what God later directly warns us? In the book of James, chapter 1, starting in verse 19, know this, God says. Let every person be quick to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Moses is exhibit 1. His anger led him to do something different than the righteousness of God. Again in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, be angry and do not sin. Don't let the sin go down on your anger and give no opportunity to the devil. It's not wrong to be frustrated. It's not wrong to feel anger. It's wrong to think that acting from that is going to produce righteousness and good things. It's our job to control our response. Thus, the lesson, our anger doesn't achieve the righteousness of God. Moses and Aaron let anger blind them to the simple commandment that God gave. I don't think they misunderstood God. I don't think that Moses went, well, I don't remember exactly what he said, but 40 years ago, he wanted me to hit the rock, so I'll just do that again. That's not what this story implies. What this story implies is that God told him clearly what he wanted, and Moses did something else, which is why God's response to him is, because you did not believe in me. And that's a warning. It's a warning to us all that when we allow ourselves to be led by our emotions, when we allow ourselves to be led by our anger particularly, when we allow ourselves to do whatever it is we feel is right under the circumstances because we feel justified, because we're mad and upset and frustrated at someone, and instead of loving them, we hate them, and instead of helping them, we devour them, and instead of stimulating them or stirring them up to love and good deeds, we seek to set a block of stumbling before them and laugh when they fall. When we do that, it's because we do not believe in God. And it's because we are not willing to honor God before others. We have to be careful. It may seem like a small matter. I mean, God had asked him to hit the rock. Moses didn't just completely make it up. Granted, it was 40 years later, but he didn't just completely make it up. There's a lot of that goes on, though. A lot done in the realm of worship that God commanded a long time ago. People aren't just randomly making all this stuff up. But it's not what God has asked from us. It's not what applies post-Christ. It isn't a small thing to disbelieve and dishonor God. That's not a small thing. It's never a small thing to disobey. You ever heard anybody say, well, it was just a little lie. It was just a little sin. All liars shall have their part in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. God has no fellowship with darkness. A little darkness is still darkness. It's not a small thing to disbelieve and dishonor God. We need to carefully listen to God, learn what he would have us to do in worship and in godliness. And we need to understand that it is his testing of us. We are being watched. He is giving these commands to see what we will do, to see if we will listen, to see if we will obey, to see if we believe in him. Listen to the word of God if you don't believe me. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 in verse 1. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. As you approach God, the writer of Ecclesiastes says, you go to him to listen to him and find out what he wants. Because to do anything else is doing evil. They don't know they're doing evil, but it doesn't change it. Because God is testing to see if we're listening. He's testing to see if we'll do what he says. He's testing our character, our love. Psalm 11 in verse 4, the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see. His eyelids test the children of men. He is watching us as we live life on this earth learning, are displaying, are judging, are laying bare and showing, however you want to express it, the character of our heart. His eyes see, his eyelids test the children of men. The Lord tests the righteous. His soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. It is certainly a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And there are a great number of people, no matter how long they've been faithful, for 40 years Moses led the people of God. Moses spoke for God. Moses had a great relationship with God. Moses had been handpicked and chosen by God for this work, and he had done it faithfully for 40 years. And then the event of number 20 come, and Moses is then told, you'll never go into the promised land. He couldn't say, but for 40 years I did what you asked. And someone can't say, well, a loving God wouldn't do that. A loving God would let Moses in. Well, read the rest of the story. When they got to the river and were ready to get in, he tells Moses, he says, you come up here on top of this mountain. You look. You see this land? That's where they're going, and you'll never step foot in it. And he took his life. We need to be very aware of the fact that God will judge his people. And we need to learn the lesson that is presented to us here, to do exactly what God would have us to do from this day forward. And never grow weary in well-doing. Because if we decide one day that we have served long enough and that we're tired and that we want to do something different, we're going to hear the same thing that Moses heard. You can't go in. And that's not what I want for me, and that's not what I want for my family, and that's not what I want for anyone in this room. That's not really what I want for anyone anywhere. But unfortunately, I know that it'll happen. Think about these things. I give them to you for your consideration.